Until recently, my knowledge of Irish literature in the 20th century has been pretty limited to some of the big names: Yeats, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett. But recently I came across Patrick Kavanagh's collected poems in a local library and thought I'd give them a go. And I've really enjoyed them. Kavanagh was one of the generation after Yeats who were facing a new reality in Ireland. The Irish Free State had been established, and whereas perhaps Yeats and others like him had been trying to generate a new Irish poetry in keeping with their nationalist intentions, poets after the independence had to face a new reality and find a new role for poetry. Kavanagh grew up in essentially a small farming family. He grew up in the peasant lifestyle, so to speak. He was self-taught. He was reading poetry by candlelight in the attic of his family home until his mother would shout at him to take the turnips out to the pigs or similar. And what particularly fascinates me about him is his reaction to Yeats and the Celtic Twilight sort of movement, the Celtic revival movement that was attempting to assemble a kind of Irish identity for their nationalist purposes. Another figure which would fit in with that general trend would be Austin Clarke, who translated some of Turlough O'Carolan's fantastic songs into English. Like Clarke, Kavanagh was a Catholic, but unlike Clarke, he was not keen on Irish nationalism as it had been manifested in the poetry of Yeats. He was very suspicious of Yeats's motives, perhaps, given that Yeats himself was not Catholic, but was from the aristocratic Protestant ascendancy, whose roots went back to the English settlers and colonists, essentially. And you'll find this throughout Kavanagh is a very bitter reaction against Yeats. He couldn't help but admire Yeats's poetic skills and example, but he very often lashes out at him. And this sense of bitterness seems to be something that pervades Kavanagh's life. In the excellent introduction by Antoinette Quinn, she notes that once he had made it to Dublin, he became known as a character, muttering to himself as he walked along, lashing out at invisible enemies. And certainly his pen could be very vicious. He would criticise almost any institution of the Irish Free State, so much so that ultimately he effectively found himself unemployable given the enemies he'd made. And in his poetry, there's a fascinating mix of an almost ecstatic, maybe mystical sense of epiphanies through the natural world, often conveyed in lines that are quite unremarkable in themselves. But generally his poems will contain a line or two that is really quite unique, really extraordinary, unusual, that completely changes the way you see the whole poem. His poems are almost artless in a way, particularly towards the end, using almost doggerel standard rhymes in a way. But they're sort of greater than the sum of their parts, and I found myself really enjoying them. His poetry about the peasant life, about his upbringing, are particularly demystifying. They're sort of rejecting the romanticised view of the peasantry as the source of, true Irishness, I suppose. They're very bleak, very harsh about almost the rural idiocy, as Marx might have termed it, or as he did term it. And it's an important corrective, I suppose, to the romanticising tendencies of someone like Yeats. And really, Kavanagh is remembered as perhaps the second greatest Irish poet of the 20th century. But he was always aware of that, and maybe that's the chip on his shoulder he had towards his illustrious predecessor. And one thing I found particularly interesting with the introduction was just this sense of how much poetry mattered in these ways, of how close it was related to the politics of the time. How this question of what Irishness was or is, of what being an Irish poet meant, could be very, very close to people's hearts. She mentioned an incident at the castle bar, the palace bar, where Kavanagh and other literary types would meet, when Austin Clarke cast aspersions on Louis MacNeice's Irishness as a poet, sort of suggesting he was selling out, going to labour for Faber and Faber, the London publishing house headed up by T.S. Eliot. And that remark led to a massive punch-up, poets brawling, and the fact that poets could find their interests worth fighting over is quite remarkable to me. But maybe Kavanagh's animosity towards Yeats comes out in the fact that his very last poem, entitled Yeats, ends with these lines. Yes, Yeats, it was damn easy for you, protected by the middle classes and the big houses, to talk about the 60-year-old public protected man sheltered by the dim Victorian muses. Quite a way to go out, really. And there's various other poems which are very satirical about the literary scene of the time. So I'd encourage you to read Kavanagh's work. It's a particularly striking example of how literary movements are often reactions to what went before them. For better or for worse, you'll have to make your mind up about that.